Hi, this is Karina from CCIA. Question overall for satellite communications and just space communications. What are your current priorities for spectrum allocations for deep space communications and also for LEO? I know, kind of a two-pronged, but related.
Thanks. So yeah, the spectrum allocation issue obviously on Earth is extremely important, and you can see that at play for space communications and launch and things like that. I think for deep space, this is kind of part of that infrastructure conversation. And so, while we're, and this is why the debate actually kind of harms this, because we want to frame space infrastructure as the same way we do Earth infrastructure, and we miss debates like that, or not debates, but opportunities like this to talk about how we should, allocate spectrum in a way that makes sense for deep space, for cislunar, and things like that. So, I mean, I think my priority, we're a priority sort of behind, I think, where your question is, and the priority should be, how we think about space infrastructure, and then we start to bring things in that can get us to answer that question better.
So we don't lobby, so we're not involved in trying to increase allocations. But I would say that to the extent that governments see this as a priority way to reach the last subscribers, to reach the last households in the rural areas, they have to make sure that there's enough spectrum that's been allocated to be able, so that the companies can meet the needs of all of the users and really do some models to make sure that there'll be enough for the usage that's required. So I think that's really the bottom line, that they have to think about it together, that this is a way that they can meet their goals, and they have to work on the spectrum allocations at the ITU and within their national governments.
This one is for the last lightning talk. I was just curious, how do you see, or do you anticipate the conversation around digital services, online publications, to shift at all with the new administration and the trifecta in government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the short answer is, who knows, but that's not helpful. What I will say is a lot of my work right now is centering on the state level, right? We just last week saw Illinois and New York introduce these bills. Australia is about to release a consultation on this. But with that, and I think a lot of kind of this America First trade policy agenda that we're seeing, there has been quite a bit of pushback from the US government to Australia and to different countries, just because the majority of the companies that do fall under this umbrella for this link tax issue are American-based. So that is so far, right? Nothing really at the federal level, but we're continuing to see a lot of action at the federal level directed towards the international part. And then, of course, the states kind of filling in there with, congressional quote-unquote inaction.
I have a question for the guys who talked about fiber and satellites. Are there any other technologies like in the middle that might also help serve different pockets, like mobile, fixed wireless, stuff like that? It's kind of in between those two technologies. I think of them kind of as polar ends and there are some intermediate technologies that are potentially useful.
Yeah, I mean, there are some. Some of them can be fed off satellite, like community Wi-Fi networks. You bring down the satellite to one space, and then you can distribute it. So that's with Wi-Fi, and then there's fixed wireless access, FWA, that that can beam it out and hit more households, but obviously not as many within the same space. So one of again, we don't lobby, but one of the ways to do it is to set some minimum requirements, like the U.S. has 100 megabits per second, and then be technology neutral, and then have states and ISPs bid to do this the most efficiently.
My question's for Juan Ortiz. Hey, great paper. We're going to shoot you an email and get the draft if possible. I wanted to ask you, you talked about 3 approaches by governments to bolster ecosystems. One of them was the ONCD approach. Can you tell me, we talk to industry a lot about how they're concerned it may be used to sort of cut off, because it is a choke point, access for companies to markets. And so I'm curious to hear your take on why that approach would actually bolster ecosystems.
So you're
you're saying that companies are expressing concern that they might get cut off from accessing customers.
Sure, because they're being asked to register on ONCD, and they're concerned that their market or their ability to operate as a platform will just be taken away by the Indian government at any point.
Yeah, I think that is a legitimate concern. At the same time, I think what the Indian government is concerned about is, they're a population of over 1 billion. They're still starting to get online. So I think it's like 40-50% of the population is online. They need to create a lot of jobs and services. And so I think they're very concerned that a platform like Amazon might take over a lot of those jobs. And so they're trying to make sure that they can keep the services sector atomized, meaning very distributed. And they think that this might create more access to jobs, not necessarily for the platforms, say for Flipkart or for an equivalent big business, but for the local shop owner that might be willing to participate in this market individually or as a small or medium-sized company. So I think that is a legitimate challenge of between the medium and small-sized companies and the large companies. I think there are reasonable concerns by big companies about whether or not they might lose access to a market because they do have to register and they could lose registration, which is, a reasonable concern.
Thank you.
I also have a question for Juan. I think your paper is really interesting, and I'm curious to know if you have any ideas or opinions on how we can regulate like the larger nodes that have a little bit more control in the system, while at the same time also minimizing the losses that we might experience from losing the network effect on these big companies. Thank you.
I think that's the million vote question, right? Not the $1 million question, but I'm very supportive of antitrust. I think there is a lot of work to be done there. I very much agree with Lina Khan on that front. And so I don't think I would add much to what she has to say. But I think, the network effects will recover or we will be rebuilt once they have to put interoperability in place. So I think once you take down the choke point, you will have companies building with open standards because they want to access each other's customer space. And so I think, so I used to work at the Web Foundation with Tim Berners-Lee, and for example, he thinks that one of the ways in which you do that is to basically separate the content layer from the storage layer. So right now in social media, for example, they control the content and the storage. Say your pictures are stored on Facebook or on Instagram, and that's also the place where you see them. So he says if we all had a data pod that is provided by a separate company or you self-store, and it's done in an open standard where you could simply shift and say, right now my pictures are visible on Instagram, but now I don't like Instagram anymore, so I'll shift and now they're visible on Blue Sky. What we need is a standard for those pictures to be, legible in the same way by all these different platforms. But he thinks that would be a way. He doesn't work on regulation. He's not a lobbyist. But I would say if some of these things could be mandated, meaning structural separation between these layers, I think it would do a lot of the legwork.
My question is Steve Williams, National Juneteenth Internet Society. My question is for the Fiber to Leo guys. One of the things that I've been trying to work out with LEO deployment, especially in urban areas, is their support for multi-tenant units. So if you have a unit where you have, everybody doesn't have clear access, to establish a satellite connection, to make it easier for you to be able to distribute that signal in a multi-tenant unit in a more effective way that doesn't require as much management from the end. So, that combined with your point about increasing what we call carrier neutral data centers for the middle mile are the two things that I'm really concerned about. But especially the LEO technology, being able to support and for them to understand to be able to support multi-tenant units without the whole myriad of complexity that you have to go through to get that done. You see any way forward on that?
Well, I worked at the FCC many years ago, and I can't remember anymore, and it's probably changed 10 times what the multi-tenant unit rules are, whether it's coming from the bottom or the top, how much competition they'll allow, and distributing it within the building. As for the LEOs, Clearly they want to serve markets, and those are, in the cities, they're obviously attractive markets. But as I mentioned, we've been hearing that Starlink might be stopping to get new subscribers in some urban areas because they're running out of capacity and they don't want to have degraded capacity. So that brings us back to the spectrum issue. And of course, they are putting up more and more satellites that'll help to increase the amount of capacity. But clearly, they want to serve it. And again, it's some of the rules on the ground in terms of multi-tenant, and that's probably country by country how you serve a building.
I really think that would be by them addressing that issue for engineering part, multiplexing a couple of fishes into these larger bits will relieve some of that pressure. But it doesn't seem like that we stepped at the really trying to work that out, especially in these communities, because it is a problem that the non-spectrum is there and access. So you can take it, even if it's got tutors already for you, tenants there, and they concentrate on being able to cluster those receivers together, it would be better than the people try to access it better there. So I was from the top down, but I see why there's something that they're looking at.
Yeah, and it's possible. I guess there's two things. One is if you have the right view, you can put it on your balcony if you're facing the right way. And no, I know. And also, there's a competitor starting to launch, and that may create some competition to try and get into those buildings.
My question is for Nick Reese. You talked about applying lessons that we've learned on Earth and space, and I was wondering if you had a little bit more that you could share there. What are some of the lessons that you think we should be applying in space? And also with that, what are some of the propagation differentials in how spectrum works in space that we also need to be asking about and paying attention to as we build infrastructure in space?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So actually, I wanted to mention during my talk, but I didn't have enough time to say that I was really glad that I went after Juan's talk, because he talked about some things, the kind of the access points and things like that we're now trying to figure out and understand and build the right way, and we're finding these kind of the gates or different nodes that we want to focus on. So I think that's an example, but a more specific example would be to build in things like security or data privacy or artificial intelligence as kind of core elements of this infrastructure. And we've sort of had to slowly walk toward it with terrestrial internet. But we're getting to a place now where we as internet users as a whole are able to kind of agree on certain elements. Now, we will never be able to agree kind of across the board with different countries that have very different value sets on what data privacy looks like. But the point is that we have an opportunity to do it, and if we want to sustain this infrastructure in space, we should be thinking about building in at the technology standards level things like data privacy measures, security measures, and even artificial intelligence to help us with some of the issues that we're going to run into in space, like the time delays and things like that we are already kind of building for. But as we scale this way up and there ends up being many more users of this system, we're already seeing what's happening with a lot of users of the Earth version. And so if we're going to do the same thing on the moon or Mars, we should consider those things from a kind of technical standards perspective. So those are the kind of the main things that I would point to as far as things we want to build in.